The slip happened at a bad time. It was cruel for me personally, and there's not a day that doesn't go by that I don't think about what if that didn't happen. Would things have been different? Would it have turned out different? Maybe it might have, I don't know. It kills me, don't get me wrong, inside it kills me, and it will do for a long time.
It's not often that you see a highly decorated athlete literally and figuratively crumble underneath the weight of a moment, but if you were watching Liverpool play Chelsea at the end of April 2014, that is exactly what you would have experienced. Liverpool were on the verge of winning their first title in nearly 25 years, and if they could get a win against Chelsea, they'd control their own destiny. No one could have realistically imagined that Liverpool, who'd finished 7th the year before, would be in this position a year later. But through some electric attacking play, including a stretch where Luis Suarez was probably the best player in the world, Liverpool scored a colossal 101 goals. The architect of a lot of those goals was their captain, Steven Gerrard, who transitioned to a deeper role that year as he entered his mid-30s and promptly led the entire league in assists. Gerrard was one of the most accomplished players in the world at that point, but the one thing that had eluded him over his illustrious career was a Premier League title. Everything was set up for a storybook ending for this club and its captain, but if you're at all familiar with this story, you know that is not how things turned out. With a few of their starters out due to injury, Chelsea set up almost exclusively to defend and frustrate Liverpool, conceding over 70% of the possession over the course of the game and rarely trying to go forward. It wasn't the most exciting of game plans, but it was working. Despite being undermanned, Chelsea were keeping Liverpool in front of them and, more importantly, out of the goal. With halftime approaching, Liverpool had the ball in their own half in stoppage time, trying to create one last chance before the ref blew the whistle. And who else would they look to but their captain to try and get things going in this otherwise pretty cagey game? And in the strictest sense, he did, but not at all in the way that Liverpool supporters would have expected or hoped.
Gerrard has slipped, and Demba Ba is through here for Chelsea. It's Ba, he scores in front of the Kop. Catastrophe for the Liverpool skipper.
As Mamadou Sakho passed him the ball, Gerrard, usually one of the most sure-footed players in the entire world, took a horrible touch as he tried to open himself up. Maybe it was because he didn't know Chelsea striker Demba Ba was there, or maybe he just lost his concentration for a second, but in any case, Gerrard did the one thing you absolutely cannot do if you're the guy closest to your own goal. And then, to make matters worse, he fell down as he tried to fix the mistake he just made, making Ba's path to the goal all that much easier. This is Demba Ba, a backup who only scored 7 league goals in his entire Chelsea career and would get unceremoniously shipped off to Turkey a few months after this, making one of the biggest plays in Premier League history. All while one of its greatest players ever just watched helplessly. Liverpool's season had seemingly been charmed up to that point, but all of that positive energy regressed to the mean in one horrifying moment as Chelsea scored what would turn out to be the deciding goal. But while this was without a doubt the defining moment of what would become Liverpool's collapse in the title race, there's something you need to understand about those types of moments, and collapses in general. No one instance can truly define a season that takes months to complete. That's just not how things work. Individual plays can have a greater impact on a season, but on the whole, especially in a months-long competition like the Premier League, individual plays are not what wins or loses a single game, let alone a league title. And even if they were, strictly speaking, losing against Chelsea at this point in the season didn't have any more bearing on the points total than losing to Hull did all the way back here in December. And that was against a team that ended up finishing 16th instead of 3rd. I don't think it's very fair to put all or even most of the blame on one player making one mistake, no matter how big it may seem. But I will say that moments like these absolutely can be the inciting incident for a team-wide collapse, which actually might put a season in danger. Think of a team-wide collapse like an infection, starting in one place and spreading to the entire team to the point that it no longer functions the way that it used to. One thing goes wrong, either a player makes a mistake, a referee makes a bad call, or something unexpected happens that alters the team flow, and suddenly there's no getting it back. Liverpool had won 11 straight games in the Premier League going into this one, a streak that had lasted more than 2 months, or they scored 38 goals and gave up just 15. There was no other team in any sport on earth that was in that kind of rhythm, but all of a sudden, none of that was working. Over the past few years, teams like the one led by Dr. Vanessa Vergen at the University of Queensland in Australia have been looking more closely at all of the various psychological conditions that can lead to a team-wide collapse. Previously, most of the research in this area focused on individual moments of poor performance relative to expectations, or what we sports fans would typically refer to as choking. But one of the key points of this paper from 2018 was that while individual choking and team collapse share a lot of the same characteristics, they are two different ideas. An individual mistake can certainly precipitate a team collapse, but as we'll see, it takes a lot more than just one guy or gal messing up to lose a game, let alone ruin an entire season. A team like Liverpool, who looked so thoroughly unstoppable up to this point, falling apart is more than just all of its individual component parts failing to perform up to expectations at the same time. There are interpersonal dynamics in play here that make a team collapse significantly more complicated than that. One of the key aspects of team collapse identified by Verkin and her team was lack of attentional focus, which is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. How we think, and subsequently how we behave, is shaped heavily by what's going on around us. And when you consider the context of what was going on in the spring of 2014, it's no wonder that it was a lot for those Liverpool players to handle. Liverpool were the undisputed dominant power in English football in the 1970s and 80s, but from right around the time that the Premier League broke away from the old First Division, they'd found it pretty hard to get back to that status. And if they wanted to fix that in this season, they'd have to hold off two of the dominant powers of the 21st century in Man City and Chelsea. Man City, who were absolutely loaded at this point, had just won against West Brom and were about to win against Crystal Palace. So to keep their lead intact, Liverpool knew that they needed to win too. Maybe that's why Steven Gerrard was so eager to try and point this attack upfield instead of just cruising into halftime tied 0-0. His attention was being influenced by something happening outside of the stadium that day. You could say the same thing about their unfortunate draw against Crystal Palace a week later. Liverpool were still in the title race even after losing to Chelsea, but needed to increase their goal difference if they wanted that to be a realistic possibility. For those of you who don't know soccer, that means they needed to score a lot, which is why they kept pushing forward even when they were up 3-0. Man City weren't technically on the field that day, but they were still having a direct effect on what was happening by keeping Liverpool's attention on them and off of what they were doing. The reality of that moment was that Liverpool were under a lot of pressure, and their captain, Steven Gerrard, most of all. Unlike a lot of the other English stars of his generation, like Frank Lampard or Wayne Rooney, Gerrard's career to that point had not been littered with league championship trophies. It was the one criticism people could still make about him, the thing that rival fans absolutely delighted in singing about. But all that could go away if he could just deliver this title to his boyhood club. Was all of that on his mind when he got the pass from Sakho? Probably not explicitly. That's kind of a deep conversation to be having internally at a moment like this, but deep down, I think he absolutely wanted to be the guy to make this happen for Liverpool. You can see it later on in the game when he was trying to make up for the mistake he made earlier, taking longer shots and making riskier passes to desperately try and get Liverpool back into it. But that's what pressure does to teams, especially those who may not be completely prepared to handle it, mentally or physically. This Liverpool team was incredibly talented, but by Gerrard's own admission, they were not especially experienced when it came to trying to win titles. They finished second in 2009, but the only player to make 30 appearances in both that season and this one was, as you might expect, Steven Gerrard. The 2014 version had more firepower, but they also relied on significant contributions from young players like Raheem Sterling, Philippe Coutinho, and Jordan Henderson, all of whom were really good but had yet to really establish themselves as Premier League stars. None of the big players at Liverpool had ever really been key contributors at a Premier League title winner either, which was a stark contrast to the groups of players at Man City or Chelsea. Those two squads were loaded with players who had won leagues before, either at their current club or at a previous one. And while not having that sort of experience doesn't automatically disqualify a team from winning, there are things that will inevitably come up over a 38-game season that it definitely pays to have dealt with before. A key psychological component of a championship team is not ever allowing morale to get too high or too low at any given point, which is a lot easier if you've been there and done it. We've talked about some of the ways that a team's negative mentality can lead to a collapse, but being too confident can derail things just as easily. And as he discussed in an interview with Rio Ferdinand in 2015, Steven Gerrard and Liverpool found that out the hard way.
I remember watching you on the TV when you had the huddle after the City game.
Yeah.
And thinking, right, they got the bit between the teeth now. Yeah. They could go on to win it. And then the game against Chelsea happened, and then you lost the league. Because if you draw that game,
I think our tactical approach was probably inexperienced for the whole game. You know, I think because we were on a good run and in good form, and no fault to Brendan at all. We sort of went in with the same tactics. You know, we heard Chelsea maybe making a few changes, and we actually had the confidence we can go and blow them away. But having not been in many title races, the inexperience of the team, our reaction was to go and chase it and hunt it down and try and make up for that cruel moment. And we lost our way. We went gung-ho instead of being more controlled and maybe just, being a little bit more calculated in the way we went about it for the equaliser.
They didn't even need to win the Chelsea game, but they went for it anyway because they were hot and didn't see a reason to change. Why would they? They'd scored at least 3 goals in 9 out of their last 11 matches. But against that opponent, at that stage in the season, that gung-ho approach wasn't working. And I don't want to discount the physical aspect of this either. Physical exhaustion is probably the most straightforward cause of a team collapse on this entire list. Keeping up that level of intensity is really hard over a 40-plus game season, especially if you're a 33-year-old midfielder who's made over 600 appearances in your career by that point. You put all those things together, the physical exertion, the mental distraction, the context of the moment, the stakes, and you get a team that is primed to self-destruct. There's one more thing that we haven't talked about yet, and that's the feeling of helplessness that comes from losing control. If Steven Gerrard isn't safe from a moment like this, then who is? The sense of a lack of control of a game situation is one of the key hallmarks of a team collapse, because once you go there mentally, there's really no coming back from it. Sure, you can try to fix it, but as Steven Gerrard himself explained, and that paper from 2018 confirms, that may end up causing more problems than it solves. Forcing things in a way that isn't natural to how you normally do them can just lead to more unforced errors, which starts a team down a vicious cycle that it can seem almost impossible to break out of. Some teams never do. All of this would start to turn around relatively quickly because about a year and a half later, Liverpool hired Jurgen Klopp, the man who would lead them to their first Premier League title, as their manager. Steven Gerrard and Brendan Rodgers ran so that Jurgen Klopp and Mo Salah could fly, I guess. But not even the many, many trophies that Liverpool have won since could erase the memory of this epic collapse, because that's not how these things work. Collapses don't show up on the box score any different than another loss, but they show up very differently in the memories of those who experience them. Collapses create narratives and shape legacies, because the difference between the expected outcome and the actual outcome is so large. Is that fair? Probably not. But the brain is wired to recognize the difference between what should be happening and what is happening, and that's not going to change anytime soon. Liverpool absolutely should have won the Premier League title in 2014. Candidly, I wanted them to. Despite being a fan of a completely different club that this Liverpool team absolutely ripped apart, this remains one of my favorite teams to watch in any sport ever, and getting a title would have been a fitting way for them to cap that season off. But largely because of what was going on in their brains, they let it slip away. And because of what's going on in ours, we will probably never let them forget it. Hey everyone, this is Will, and I want to take a second to thank you for watching the video and for sticking around all the way to the end. This is my channel, Student of the Game, where we look into all things sports psychology and culture, and whatever sport I feel like talking about at the time or is currently doing something interesting or important, or both. This video was definitely the former, but gave me the chance to talk about some really cool research that was super interesting to get to break down for you guys. I hope you liked it, and if you did, you can let me know by clicking the button, and even subscribing to the channel. Both help me out immensely, because there are more sports nerds like us out there that I would very much like to connect with. Until next time though, I'm Will. See you guys soon.